Let's delve into the macabre, beginning with the unsettling and progressing to the downright horrifying. Number 10. The Rat Dungeon. A dread-inducing tale from medieval London, England. This ominous cell, nestled at the depths of the London Tower, instilled paralyzing fear even in the most calloused criminals. The dungeon, shrouded in complete darkness, was ingeniously connected to the adjacent river, positioned just below the waterline. When the river swelled, rats inhabiting the riverbed were forcefully displaced, swimming downstream toward the dungeon entrance. As the hungry and enraged rats converged on the cell, prisoners shackled within remained oblivious, unable to see the impending horror. A prisoner's only auditory connection to the impending doom was the soft scurrying of rat feet infiltrating the dungeon. Within minutes, these seemingly harmless noises multiplied into a cacophony as hundreds of angry rodents surrounded the captive. The aggressive rats, devoid of mercy, commenced biting the helpless prisoner, who, with no means of defense, could only endure the torment. While the prisoner might resist the relentless assault for a few hours, exhaustion would inevitably set in, rendering him unconscious. During his slumber, the relentless rats persisted, gnawing at his flesh. Upon awakening, the prisoner would be confronted with the gruesome aftermath, hundreds of bites covering his entire body. This gruesome punishment extended for days or even weeks, contingent on the severity of the prisoner's crime. As the medieval era waned, this method of cruelty transformed into a more sinister iteration, evolving into a form of execution. Prisoners would be cast into the dungeon, condemned to be forgotten in the chilling embrace of the rat dungeon. Number 9. The Rack. A haunting chapter within the London Tower's history, the infamous rack. This torture device, prevalent across various historical contexts, aimed at extracting confessions, primarily from criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war. Resembling a large ladder, its steps, instead of being secure, would rotate akin to a rolling pin. Once a prisoner was secured on the rack, feet and wrists bound to a ratchet pulley system, two officials would systematically tighten the ropes, increasing strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows with each turn. While ostensibly employed for information retrieval, the truth often blurred, as prisoners, under duress, confessed to what they believed officials wanted to hear. Sometimes compliance secured release, but deceit led to intensified torture. Post-torture, prisoners often emerged with dislocated joints and, in some instances, complete paralysis. In 1447, England witnessed a tragic case when 25-year-old Anne Askew endured hours on the rack, leaving her paralyzed. Accused of reading and memorizing Bible scriptures, which she privately preached to a small group of women, Anne refused to name them during her torture. In a society dominated by the Catholic Church, deviating from its doctrines carried severe consequences. Anne's own husband betrayed her, leading to her eventual demise. Carried on a chair, she faced burning alive at the stake. The price she paid for her beliefs marked a dark chapter in the annals of religious intolerance. Number 8. Keel hauling. This cruel maritime punishment targeted sailors who engaged in theft or violence, often culminating in fatality. Keel hauling commenced by binding a sailor's arms with rope, looping it around the entire ship and securing it to his feet. Thrown overboard, the group on board would drag him around the ship, including over the keel, from which the punishment draws its name. Frequently, sailors met their demise before reaching the keel, contingent on the efforts of the crew handling the rope that day. Amidst the drowning and the breaking of backs and necks on the keel, sailors also faced being lacerated by sharp barnacles on the ship's exterior. If, by some chance, a sailor survived the ordeal, 3 outcomes awaited. Firstly, he might endure a second round, typically resulting in death. Secondly, he could be released, returning to the ship to succumb slowly to infections. Lastly, if he miraculously lived, he'd spend the rest of his days alone, bearing scars from head to toe and enduring mockery from his peers. Number 7. Crushed by elephants. Now we enter the section of the list where survival becomes an improbable notion. This method of punishment, employed by various nations throughout history, found its most recent application in 19th century India, a period not too distant considering the span of generations. Reflect for a moment. Your great-grandmother could have potentially witnessed one of these gruesome events. The question arises, what transgressions warranted the crushing weight of an elephant? Failing to pay taxes was sufficient. Theft or being an enemy soldier also earned one a place under the massive foot of an elephant. However, history recounts a particularly disturbing incident during the reign of the fourth Mughal emperor of India. On a whim, he ordered a vast number of criminals to be crushed to death in a single day, solely for his amusement. The condemned encompassed a spectrum of offenses, from the tax evader to the apple thief and even a jaywalking orphan. Yet the most unsettling case involved a murderer who, with macabre creativity, added his victim's remains to a pot of tomato soup, serving it to his unsuspecting family while lurking in the shadows with a sinister smirk. Surprisingly, his culinary skills earned him a peculiar kind of leniency. Public execution by elephant involved various methods, but a constant was the presence of a handler atop the elephant, orchestrating its every move. This deliberate choice aimed to emphasize the perceived prowess of the ruling class, a spectacle showcasing their ability to command even the mighty elephant. Prepare to be astonished. The initial execution method, the one you'd hope for if this fate befell you, involved criminals having their arms bound behind their back, their heads placed on a pedestal, and then crushed by the mighty foot of an elephant, much like grapes in a wine press. However, the second method proved far more brutal. The criminal lay flat on the ground, arms secured behind their back, as elephants were directed to walk over their body. Ideally, the criminal would perish on the first attempt, but there were instances where only limbs were crushed, necessitating the elephant to make U-turns, repeatedly attempting to end the condemned's life. The ultimate and most horrendous approach involved a highly trained elephant systematically crushing the person limb by limb. The arms were first, followed by the legs, and then the tusks would inflict puncture wounds until delivering the final, fatal blow to the head or torso. This macabre theatrics, favored by rulers like the fourth Mughal, created a profoundly traumatizing experience for onlookers, except, of course, for the fourth Mughal himself, who reveled in the spectacle. Number 6. Impalement. Unquestionably one of the most repulsive and brutal forms of punishment on this list, historically used by various countries, but notably employed in 17th century Egypt, primarily against highway robbers, grave thieves, and rebellion instigators. The gruesome procedure commenced with the criminal lying prone, arms tightly bound behind their back. A razor sliced them open to enlarge the posterior opening, the fresh incision promptly coated with a paste to staunch the bleeding. A long wooden stake, tapered at one end and as wide as a man's arm, was then thrust into the cut. A mallet relentlessly drove the stake deeper, greased in advance for a smoother process. Once the stake emerged from the criminal's shoulder, head, or mouth, their demise was imminent. They were left planted by a busy road, serving as a gruesome reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. Displayed for the entire day, the body was removed before decay set in the next morning. An alternate version saw criminals impaled just deep enough to keep them in place, strategically positioned on stakes with a seated groove to prevent sliding. Placed along a bustling road, they endured hours of suffering, pleading for help from passers-by until succumbing to their wounds. A macabre spectacle echoing the harsh consequences of transgressing the law. Number 5. Peine coulée. Peine coulée was a horrifying and cruel punishment exclusively reserved for those who committed the heinous act of murdering their own family members. Originating in Rome during the 2nd century, it resurfaced in 18th century Germany. The macabre ritual commenced with the convicted murderer confined within a thick leather bag. To dispel any solitude, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey were added to the bag, although the animal's transgressions remained unknown. This grotesque assembly was then sewn shut, forming an almost airtight seal. Just when one might assume the horror had peaked, the ordeal escalated further. The sealed bag, now containing both man and beasts, was callously tossed into the unforgiving ocean. Astonishingly, murderers were later given a choice: endure the leather bag or face an alternative fate at the Colosseum. There they could opt for a grisly performance, being mauled to death before their loved ones and peers. A dark choice, but at least an option was afforded to those condemned. Number 4. Rats. One of the most gruesome punishments in human history involves the horrifying use of rats. Two variations of this cruel method will be explored here due to their striking similarity. The first instance traces back to 1568 during the 80 Years' War, when Dutch leader Diederik Sonoy employed this brutal technique. A rat was placed inside a clay bowl, inverted onto a prisoner's stomach, chest, face, or groin. The bowl's backside was heated with a torch or coals, compelling the panicked rat to burrow into the human, gnawing and tearing through flesh in a desperate attempt to escape the searing heat. The rat, surviving the ordeal, left behind a tragic fate for the prisoner. The second method, exponentially worse, was shrouded in secrecy during the dictatorial rule of Augusto Pinochet from 1976 to 1983. Dubbed the rectoscope, its horror was not hard to decipher. A tube was affixed to a prisoner's rectum, allowing the insertion of a rat. As the rat burrowed, the sadistic perpetrators expected prisoners to answer questions amid their excruciating agony. The true extent of casualties from this ghastly punishment remains unknown, but a multitude of disappearances occurred during Pinochet's tyrannical reign. Number 3. Gibbeting. The last documented use of this method was in early 1900s Afghanistan. Its exposure came in 1921 when National Geographic published an image, shedding light on its implementation. In the United States, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries, Boston served as a site where pirates were hanged at the harbor, sending a stark warning to approaching sailors. England, enamored with this form of punishment, applied it to traitors, murderers, pirates, and thieves. However, the Murder Act of 1752 altered the execution landscape, mandating that convicted murderers be publicly dissected or subjected to some form of gibbeting. Over 134 individuals confirmed to have met this fate, with cages being the prevalent form. These steel cages conformed tightly to the human body, rendering any movement impossible. Suspended 30 feet or more above the ground, often in public spaces, they ensured maximum visibility for the public, though the constant presence of a dying man pleading for water may have been more of an annoyance than a spectacle. The torment didn't conclude with the criminal's demise. After death, the bodies were left to rot inside the cages for years, inflicting a foul stench on the locals. Reports suggested that human remains lingered for over 2 decades before a government official remembered to address the issue. Number 2. Scaphism. This ancient Persian Empire's punishment for murder was ghastly. The convicted would be confined on their back in a boat, tied down with limbs protruding through cut-out holes. Force-fed copious amounts of honey and milk until visibly full, they'd coat their entire body with the sticky mixture. Pushed into the middle of a lake, exposed to scorching sun, the horrific ordeal unfolded. The honey and milk weren't a final feast but a cruel trick, inducing extreme diarrhea. This, combined with the sweet mixture, attracted hordes of rodents, bugs, wasps, bees, and flies. Nightly torment by these creatures persisted, making the daytime no respite. At sunrise, the person received another hefty dose of milk and honey, prolonging the torment. Rodents relentlessly attempted to burrow into the person, anticipating their next meal. Writer Joanne Zonaras vividly recounted an incident lasting 17 days, describing it as one of the most horrid punishments with seemingly no end. The survivor's face covered in wasps, flesh rotting away, swarmed by parasites and worms, encapsulated a nightmarish existence until death mercifully arrived. Number 1. The oubliette. Oubliette, derived from the French word for to forget, signified a form of punishment employed throughout history, notably in the London Tower's notorious chamber named Little Ease. This pitch-black, confining space denied prisoners the ability to sit, stand, or lie comfortably for days on end. Warwick Castle, in the neighboring district, housed another infamous oubliette in its dungeons, an austere stone cell with a metal door that sealed prisoners in, condemning them to be forgotten. As the name suggested, prisoners left within these cells awaited an inevitable death, typically succumbing to dehydration or starvation within a few days. However, This grim fate was a best-case scenario. Often, a decomposed corpse would already occupy the cell, serving as a morbid companion and a stark reminder of impending doom. The dungeons, infested with rats that had acquired a taste for human flesh, added to the prisoner's harrowing ordeal. The prevalence of oubliettes extended across numerous European castles, and recent discoveries of these dungeons revealed the grim reality. Dozens, if not hundreds, of human remains lay within, evidence of neglect and a lack of cleaning. Leap Castle in Ireland, during its 1900 renovation, uncovered a hidden opening behind a chapel wall, leading to an 8-foot drop and a larger oubliette, filled with numerous skeletons requiring multiple carloads for removal. But the tales don't end there. Stories abound of men enduring years inside these dungeons, subsisting on meager food scraps and minimal water, defying their impending demise. Some cells, strategically placed at ground level, allowed prisoners to hear the outside world's voices and laughter, an experience they would never again enjoy in their lifetime. The dungeons, repositories of suffering and forgotten lives, tell haunting stories of the dark chapters in history.